Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here this morning. I know to hear a discussion on a very, very important topic. My name is Antrell Tyson, and I'm the District Director for Congresswoman Lucy McBath. As you all may know, that Congress is currently in session today. It's a flat-out day, so she and also Congresswoman Kelly are on the floor voting, so they will not be here at the top, but they will. We do expect their arrival at some point during the discussion, so please stick around for that. So we want to go ahead and get things started off by introducing our moderator, Mr. Don Calloway, who is the founder of Pine Street Strategies and the National Voter Protection Fund, and also MSNBC contributor. So without further ado, I would like to bring to you Mr. Don Calloway.
Good morning. Thank you all so much for coming out. It is a blessing to have all of you here. As you all know, ALC, CBC has a reputation for essentially being Freaknik in suits. Some of you all are a little younger. Ask your parents about Freaknik. Anyway, we'll discuss that later. Actually, we won't discuss that later. But as I try to impress upon everybody who comes to Washington, D.C., this is the annual legislative conference. It's not just CBC. There are substantive discussions to be had with our nation's finest power brokers and thinkers and thought leaders and authors and scholars, and we are here to find solutions to real topics facing our community. So thank you all so much for coming to D.C. and convening on the thought leadership sessions that are in this Braintrust. I'd like to thank our fantastic hosts, Congresswoman Lucy McBath of Decatur, Georgia. Unfortunately, nobody knows more about gun violence and its real family effects and human effects than Congresswoman Lucy McBath. She is a fantastic freshman member of the House Democratic Caucus, represents Georgia's 3rd Congressional District? 6th Congressional District, please forgive me, Decatur, Georgia. And she has her fantastic district director with us today, Brother Antrell Tyson. Thank you all for having me. And Congresswoman Robin Kelly of the greater Chicagoland area, Illinois' 2nd Congressional District, is also our host. She'll be with us after votes are cast. She's represented here right now by her fantastic and erudite Chief of Staff, Brother Brandon Webb. Congresswoman brings an interesting perspective to this because she has always looked at gun violence in the city of Chicago and nationwide as a public health epidemic. And that's part of what we are here to talk about today, is gun violence from several different perspectives. As a public health issue, as a law enforcement issue, as a very real community issue that affects families, as a medical issue which affects the costs and the prices and the real situation around healthcare for all of us every day as Americans, and ultimately as a community activism and training issue. What can organizers such as Kelly do to train our young people to be in a mind state where they don't approach gun violence in the same way that generations before them have? So again, we're looking forward to a substantive discussion today. I'm going to introduce our panelists, let all of them give their spiel on how they address issues of gun violence. We will ask them some questions, but I really want this to be more interactive so all of you all will have the opportunity to participate and learn as much as I do and as much as we all have, as their colleagues do every day. I will start from my left. Commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department, the city's 41st police commissioner, Brother Michael Harrison, is with us today. He was just appointed the commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department, the top cop in Baltimore, in March of 2019. Before that, he served for 28 years as a leader in the New Orleans Police Department. Prior to that, a member of the Louisiana National Guard. He has a bachelor's degree in criminal justice, so he knows this stuff, from the University of Phoenix, and a master of criminal justice from Loyola University of New Orleans, as well as the Northwestern University School of Police Staff. Please welcome Commissioner Michael Harrison. I'm going to skip around a little bit. Brother Michael Sean Spence, how many of you all have heard of Everytown? You all who have thought a lot about the gun space have heard of Everytown. Well, Michael Sean Spence is the Director of Policy and Implementation at Everytown for Gun Safety. So in the wake of mass shootings and as we talk about gun violence in our communities every day, everybody throws out solutions, but we like to bring subject matter experts to the table who actually knows the effects of this policy and who knows what real policies will work for real communities, specifically African-American communities. Brother Michael Sean oversees Everytown's National City Gun Violence Initiative, domestic violence court monitoring programs, and he collaborates every day with elected officials, local gun violence prevention groups, and with Everytown membership groups to advance and implement evidence-based gun violence prevention strategies. Again, gun violence solutions in the policy world are not one size fits all. So Brother Michael Sean brings expertise where he'll talk about very distinctive evidence-based solutions to gun violence. He's a lawyer. He served as assistant district attorney in Queens, the Queens Prosecutor's Office, where he prosecuted intimate partner violence and organized white-collar crime. He is a nationally recognized speaker. He's often appeared on BET, Infuse, contributor to Black Enterprise, and we look forward to hearing from our great HU School of Law graduate today. Welcome, Brother Michael Sean. Dr. Cheryl Herron. We want to talk very specifically today about how gun violence has actual effects on the medical community that ripple throughout all of us and affect all of us and how we experience our American healthcare system. That's why we have with us today Dr. Cheryl Herron, who is a professor and vice chair of administrative affairs in the Department of Emergency Medicine and the assistant dean for medical education and student affairs on the Grady campus and associate director of Education and Training for the Injury Prevention Research Center at Emory University. She comes to us from Atlanta. She is the past chair of the Emergency Medicine Section of the National Medical Association, NMA, the National Black Doctors. She has been accoladed with awards throughout her career, as recently as 2018 that addressed diversity and inclusion. She received the inaugural Wes Curry Executive Leadership Award in Diversity and Inclusion at the annual Emergency Medicine Executive Summit and the inaugural Excellence in Diversity and Inclusion Award for the Emory University School of Medicine. In 2012, she was named the inaugural president of the Academy for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Medicine and the Society for Academic Emergency Medicine and is an editor for the first textbook of emergency medicine published in 2016 entitled Diversity and Inclusion in Quality Patient Care. Dr. Herron has lectured all over the world on wellness and work-life balance, diversity and inclusion issues, emergency medicine issues, and she is of proud Jamaican heritage and is a committed family woman, which explains why she has so many jobs. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Herron. Another HU graduate, Sister Kelly Fair, is a graduate of Howard University and has a master's degree from the University of Iowa. She is the founder, and since 2009, a 10-year-old organization, she founded Polished Pebbles Girls Mentoring Program. Polished Pebbles has served approximately 500 girls aged 7 through 17 at 11 sites throughout the city of Chicago in collaboration with the University of Chicago Housing Authority and the University of Chicago Charter Schools. She coordinates with over 100 volunteer mentors throughout the Chicagoland community, Bloomingdale department store. She has really pulled together a unique collaboration to support the city of Chicago as they try to grapple with gun violence. Every day on the news, you hear pundits and folks talking about Chicago, and it rankles my whatevers because I just want to say, keep Chicago's name out your mouth if you ain't part of the solution. Well, we welcome Sister Kelly Fair because she is a part of the solution on the ground, organizing young people in Chicago. Welcome, Sister Kelly Fair. And lastly, it is incredibly important, we just talked a moment ago in a little green room, that we always center our human issues. We see gun violence, but that tends to be detached from our individual experiences, but you have to remember that these are real people and real families affected by these issues. We are blessed to have with us today the Queen, our sister Queen Afi Gaston, who is a proud Washingtonian, a native from inside the diamond. She was born here in Washington, D.C., and is the proud mother of 3 children, Dwells Gaston, James Stevens III, and Smiley Nana Gaston, who is no longer with us as a result of gun violence, and Queen will talk about that with us today. She's a graduate of McKinley High School, and she currently works for DVWMT, Domestic Violence Wears Many Tags, which is an educational resource for the prevention of domestic violence. She has a master's degree. She has a bachelor's degree in business administration, a bachelor of science in criminal justice from the American Intercontinental University, a master's degree in Capella University, and is currently pursuing her PhD in human and behavioral studies. So next time we hear from the Queen, we will address her properly as Dr. Queen Afi Gaston. Welcome, and welcome. Thank you for being here with us today. So, again, I want to have this conversation in a few distinct silos: public health, law enforcement, policy, organizing on the street, in the hospitals, and the actual medical costs and the medical effects of all of this. But it is important that we always center people, and we always make sure to elevate and first discuss the human experience. So we turn to you, we turn to the Queen to lead us in our discussion about your personal and your family experience with gun violence and the path forward from there.
Thank you for having me. I'm Queen Afi, the founder of Domestic Violence Wears Many Tags organization, as he stated. I founded the organization in 2008 to begin a journey of a conversation that many of us are still taboo about. The reason why I started the organization was because I was a victim and an abuser. So I wanted to, do my research, see who was talking about victim and abuser in this conversation. And nobody is. We are talking about the victim and the abuser, which could be women, it could be men, it could be teens, boys, and girls who are growing up in households where domestic violence is prevalent. And I'm subject to say, of course, if domestic violence is prevalent, gun violence is probably not too far. So I've been on this journey for the last, 10 years, having this conversation with the community about domestic violence and those many tags that it wears. It is affecting our family terribly, terribly, because it's still a conversation that we don't want to have. It's still a conversation that we sugarcoat, and then if you have domestic violence and gun violence is not too far, how far is mental illness? Mental health, how far is that from the dinner table? These are conversations that we are taboo and shy to talk about right at home at the dinner table. The other thing about my organization is that we're bringing in the abuser to have the conversation, because how are we going to end it without knowing the abuser's side? I mean, it's easy to tell a victim to just leave, but where's he or she going to go with that abuser knowing everything about that victim? The victim will 9 times out of 10 be killed, because this is a conversation that we must get educated on, that we must talk to our teens about, to our young people about this conversation. Along this journey, I'm having that conversation in the school, church, on the street corner. I don't care, in your backyard, I don't care, wherever you are. I'm having the conversation. And I get a call on July 30th that my daughter was shot in the head. My 19-year-old daughter, I'm asleep at night, you wake up and on the news, there's my daughter who's been shot in the head by her baby father. And she had traveled with me along the journey, having the conversations 7 years before she was murdered. So she knew some things about domestic violence and gun violence. But she still ended up in a relationship where her life was taken while she was holding her 2-month-old daughter. And I told my daughter, I said, look, if your boyfriend, carries a gun, he may use it on you. Oh, he not crazy, Mom, he not crazy, he not going. I said, he is. See, our young people do not take this seriously. And then we've opted to leave out young men when it comes to this conversation. The men are excluded. The young boys are excluded when we're talking about domestic violence. And many men and young boys are victims of domestic violence. But we don't talk to them. Had somebody would have been talking to my daughter's murderer about domestic violence, maybe she could be alive. But because I go to countless schools and in the city around, seeing who's having a conversation, everybody is talking to the girls. But when do we pull the young men together and see them as victims of domestic violence too? When do we talk to them about their feelings about domestic violence and putting up with girls, calling them, belittling them, shunning them, possibly threatening violence towards our young boys? And they do it. I know they do it. I know our young girls are abusers too. But we're not having that full circle conversation. Most of the research is focused on women that are victims of domestic violence. And that's not the case at this point. This is all that I'm left with of my daughter. The washcloth that he decided to use to try to bring her back to life. This is all that I'm left with. And I'm not the only mother suffering. I'm not the only parent suffering. We have got to start talking about domestic and gun violence at our dinner tables. If you are going through it or you know someone that is going through, put a bug in their ear. Share a resource. No, you can't make them leave, but share something. Tell them, say, this is not right. I don't want another mother or father to have to walk around with this. And a baby who's left with no parents. Thank you for letting me share.
Thank you for sharing. Now, I see in the audience my brother Jared Boyd, who works for the city of St. Louis. Jared and I had the privilege of growing up in the city of St. Louis when it was universally considered one of the top 3 most dangerous places in this country on any given day. And the other 2 cities that were in the battle with us, Chicago has since caught up from what we hear, but we believe better about Chicago. But the other 2 cities that were consistently in the most dangerous places in the country discussion with the city of St. Louis were New Orleans, where Commissioner Harrison came from, and Baltimore, where Commissioner Harrison is now. So I would like for you, Commissioner, to end us with talking about what you're doing now in the city of Baltimore and some of the law enforcement-based solutions. But these experiences, be they St. Louis or Compton or all the legendarily violent neighborhoods that we hear about, these experiences are not unique, despite our accents may be different or some things that we say and do are a little bit different, but these experiences are the same. So talk from a law enforcement perspective about what you have seen around the country as some of the root causes, and ultimately what we can do collaboratively from a law enforcement perspective to get to some of the solutions that we can apply to every city in the context that you've seen.
Well, thank you so much. And you brought up something that's so important that usually gets left out of many of the conversations. You said root causes. So I want to make sure I touch on that. And Queen, you said something I want to come back to. You said, if he has a gun, he'll use it. So I want to come back to that also. And though I'm the commissioner in Baltimore, I'm very blessed. I was the chief in New Orleans for 4.5 years. This is really good to see so many young people in the audience because we're usually talking to adults and more mature people, but it's great to see you here. The thing I think we've seen around the country, especially in those 2 cities, when it comes to gun and gun violence, is it is a culture. It is a culture of violence where people think they have to carry guns, and we have to go to why they think they have to do that. It's usually because they think they will need to use it. Here's what I say all over the country. the point that at the point the trigger is pulled is not the decision to use the gun. That's not when we make the decision to pull the trigger. The decision is actually made, and you touched on this, when the person walks out of the door with the gun. When they leave home with it, they said, if I need it, I'll have it.
That's right.
And if I need it, I'll use it. We've already made up our mind. It is a tool, just like that tool is given to law enforcement should we need it. The average person around the country uses it as a tool, and if they need it, they'll have it. And the decision is made long before they ever pull the trigger. So it is a culture that we in law enforcement are working to change. Many times, people are doing it because of either a lack of consequences or a lack of fear of consequences. Either the consequences don't exist or people don't fear the consequences. So it then becomes a partnership with district attorneys' offices and judges to make sure that we are doing the appropriate thing, catching the right people, having consequences. Now, I am not, though I'm the commissioner of Baltimore and the former chief of New Orleans, I'm here representing the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. And though we talk about consequences, I don't want people to think I'm in favor of some legislative amount of time. It is the swiftness and the certainty of the consequence. That people should know that if I do this, there's a certainty that I'll get caught, and there's some certainty of a consequence. Not necessarily the severity of it, but the certainty of it. Sometimes there's a lack of that, and then young men decide
So said alternatively, you need to know that you will be caught.
You need to know that you will be caught, and there will be a consequence for that action. And then that action tears apart lives, and then what happens is it just breeds so much anger and resentment that it creates a retaliatory effect. Then people want to retaliate using the same methodology, using guns to go retaliate. And that is a culture through strong consequences, through community engagement, through education, through community partnerships with for-profit, non-profit, faith-based, academic-based, to get a message out to our people that conflict resolution skills need to be taught and teach our people how to deal with their issues outside of violence. Because just like the tool of a trade, you're going to refer to your tool when you need it. A plumber will have his or her tools. An electrician will have his or her tools, and they'll use those tools. We have to teach people that they should not need to carry a gun, because if they do, they'll use it. Here's what the statistics show, and I don't want to really get into much of that, but the same people who get caught carrying guns inevitably are the same people who are the victims of shootings and are the perpetrators of shootings. And across this country, now in 2 major cities that I've worked in, and when I talk to my chiefs who are my peers around the country, we see the same thing. The victims of murders and shootings are the same people who commit murders and shootings, and by and large are the same people who get caught carrying guns, and we know are carrying them and sometimes don't get caught. It's the same group. So if we can change the thinking of I need to carry it, we can save people's lives and stop the amount of shootings that happen.
Okay. Dr. Herron. Dr. Herron, you are, as your bio reveals, a veritable expert in the medical fields, but specifically related to the trauma of emergency medical situations, which essentially many times are the result of gun violence. You've worked across the country, you've lectured around the world on these topics, and I know you've brought a very special pair of shoes with you today. Talk to us about the institutional healthcare effects on all of us, whether or not we've experienced gun violence directly or indirectly, but we all participate in our healthcare system, and you have seen up close what gun violence does to the healthcare system, which drives all of our economic participation. So talk to that and whatever else you want. You have seen it up close in hospitals.
So thank you, and thank you all for being here, and thank you. And to the panelists and my co-brothers and sisters in the struggle, I appreciate your work. Amen. I just need to say that out loud. Yes, I have a lot of things behind my name, but first and foremost, I'm a human being, as are all of you, and I have spent the last 23 years of my life trying to address something that I did not know I would need to address. And I start there because, yes, there is and will continue to be an economic toll on gunshot wound patients who I have seen at the largest trauma center in the Southeast, Grady Memorial Hospital, where I started my career. But I will tell you that I want to just focus a little bit on the emotional toll. So yes, I wear red shoes. And people say, well, why do you wear red shoes when you go to work in the trauma bay? And I will tell you that my first foray into looking at this topic of firearms and family violence, and I resonate with you, Queen, started in 1999 when I wrote my first paper on firearms and family violence with my mentor, colleague, and friend, Dr. Arthur Kellerman, also at Emory, also worked at Grady. And we looked at the realities about gun ownership and the implications thereof. And in November of last year, you should have heard, or would have heard, about Dr. Tamara O'Neal, a woman in medicine like me, looked like me, African-American woman, who was murdered by a bullet, actually several, that took her out of our realm of work. And so I knew Tamara, and I was paralyzed in pain, suffering, and I wrote about why I wear red shoes. I wear red shoes for her. And the bloodshed every day, I walk into the emergency department, where we know that 100 people die every day by gunshot wounds, where we know that we are appropriately in attune to mass shootings, 0.2, 0.3% of gunshot wounds reside there. I invite you to think about the impact not just on the people who are gone and their families, but for people like me and others who work and care for survivors. Because while we talk about homicide, we don't talk about the sequelae of injury. Gunshot wounds paralyze. They cause traumatic brain injury. They cause death from infection. And when people ask me as a medical physician, and you heard last year, is this your lane? It is our lane. And more physicians recognize, understand, and appreciate that all of us who work in medicine, whether you're a physician, a nurse, an EMT, a paramedic, an advanced practice provider, you are impacted and affected as I was. The economic tolls are horrendous. They're horrendous. And it's not just lives lost, which is paramount. It is the potential for what people can do with their lives when they're killed. Statistics are real. If they say that $229 billion is the economic toll of gun violence, that's something to consider. 229 billion, with a B, not an M, of the impact of the economic toll. The injuries that have been studied related to this and continue to be looked at range across that staggering number. And while we talk about numbers, we're talking about people. And we talk about people, we have to consider the emotional toll that it renders for all of us who are impacted. And if you have personally and or individually seen or been a part of a narrative for gunshot wounds, would you please raise your hand? So it's real. And I can easily, quickly attend to your gunshot wounds and your injuries. That's what I've been trained to do. I went to Howard University College of Medicine. I have to put that in there. Trained at Martin Luther King Jr. Hospital in Los Angeles, both HBCU, bred and born. But it's personal for me. My red shoes will continue to remind me, and when I'm asked why I wear them for the bloodshed, the blood lost, and the pain we should all feel when we encounter this public health, thank you, crisis.
Thank you, Dr. Herron. Sister Kelly Fair, you know, ALC is a celebratory time, but what tends to get lost in politics and public affairs as an avenue to notoriety and celebrity, what tends to get lost is that there are people who have their sleeves rolled up on the grounds in these communities doing real work. And Sister Kelly Fair is one of those people in one of our most troubled cities of Chicago. Polished Pebbles is 10 years old now, has changed the course of the lives of at least 500 girls, has brought together a diverse public, private, corporate, institutional cross-section of players to really invest in these young girls' lives. So, Sister Kelly, talk to us about some of the common patterns that you see as you address these young people, and what are the common issues they deal with? How does gun violence affect their lives? And what are some of the things that you continue to try to instill in them to show them the way forward?
Sure. So I'm very grateful to be here at the invitation of my Congresswoman, Congresswoman Robin Kelly, who I think really demonstrates leadership when it comes to elevating the voice of community organizations, community leaders, to make sure that the awareness of the work that we do and the support is there as well. It's been a wonderful journey over 10 years in running Polished Pebbles, being in Chicago, and not just for what we know about the violence in Chicago. Chicago is an extremely political city. And so making an organization that has focused on African-American girls and girls from the Latinx community is no easy task. In 10 years, we've actually served more than 3,000 girls throughout Chicagoland, its suburbs, Indiana. We've done some work in Texas. And then we've worked with elementary, middle school, and high school students, but we've also piloted a college edition of our program with young women of color at Duke University as well. So we're really working on creating a pipeline from the schoolyards to college campuses, helping girls become great communicators at home, school, and the future workplace. In Polished Pebbles, we want girls to be great communicators, and we mean it in every sense of the word. Basic stuff, like can you introduce yourself to somebody new? In Polished Pebbles, we call that shining, S-H-I-N-E. S is for smile, H is for saying hello, I is for introducing yourself and giving 3 facts, N is for nodding your head, and E is for ending the conversation. But for us, working with the girls, and we've been in without over 3,000 girls in over 100 public schools, charter schools, and public housing communities throughout all those different areas. We are dealing with girls that are seeing and experiencing high levels of trauma in their homes and their communities before they even hit the school doors. They're coming from family situations very similar to what you've heard about today. And so what we strive to do with Polished Pebbles is make sure that that Polished Pebbles mentors that trusting adult that helps girls, equip them with the tools to lift their voice, find out how to express themselves, and then breathe that bridge to the support services in that school. The biggest way that we try and engage girls in thinking about why it's important to be a good communicator, because great communication skills can help you avoid peer-to-peer conflict. Great communication skills can help you better get along with your mama. You know, everybody woke up on the wrong side of their bed. Your mama got on your nerves this morning. You know, sometimes teachers, principals say things that we don't always care for. But those communication skills help you bridge the gap and find a more appropriate way of dealing with that. And so what we serve to do is be that bridge so that girls can find that, but we use the future workplaces, the campus, to help them do that. Back in the late 80s, I was one of the first girls that took part in Take Your Daughter to Work Day. I was all over that. I was like, oh, get out of school, get free McDonald's for lunch, and go to work with my dad. Fortunately, I had a dad who had that kind of career that could take me with him to work. You fast forward to the girls that we work with currently, we are essentially bringing that Take Your Daughter job shadow experience to communities of girls whose parents may not have those type of careers, to expose them to pathways that may help them provide other opportunities to think beyond violence. And so we've partnered with a variety of different businesses, Bloomingdale's, Microsoft, Blue Cross Blue Shield, to provide those type of experiences. So we're trying to help girls build those social, emotional skills that will help them be more successful where they are and definitely more successful in the future workplace. What do we need? We need resources. We need support. I'm grateful for the leadership providing platforms for a practitioner like myself, because when you look at the data in the reports, the type of programming that we need for girls is not really supported. There are no resources as they should be for girls. What we call in polished pebbles, you guys have all heard about Chicago. I can't go nowhere without people saying, oh my God, you live in Chicago. And then I have the nerve to be from the south side of Chicago at the same time. So we've all heard the headlines, and some true, some not. But the reality is we hear mostly about boys, and appropriately so. But what's gone unheard is the crisis, and in Polished Pebbles we call it the other side of the crisis of what our girls are facing. When they're in schools, they're being criminalized. They're being experiencing adultification. And so they're being pushed out of schools. Their numbers in detention, expulsions, suspensions far outweigh any other group of girls, and in many cases are higher than black and brown boys as well. Their numbers in out-of-school confinement are raising as well. We have to build awareness to get more resources. Do I know gun violence? Yes, because I've experienced it with the young people that I work with. I've experienced it in the communities I grew up with. I experienced it Monday. Came back to my office, pulled up around 3 or 4 p.m. to finish up some meetings with some staff members, and saw an all too familiar scene. 2 or 3 police trucks, the yellow tape, and the evidence numbers put down on the ground. So it's a very real issue for all of us, for the girls in the communities that we serve, but we live and we work in those communities as well. So know intimately what the needs are, what the experiences of that girl walking to school, what she's experiencing.
So ultimately, ALC is a policy conference. And so what we're supposed to do is take on an issue holistically and hear various sides and hear all the different elements that go into the discussion of these complex issues around healthcare and education, and in this instance, gun violence. But a policy conference ultimately has to take all these aspects in and distill them into actionable items that you can take back to your homes and try to put into play in terms of real policy that ultimately solves these major crises of our time. And that's why we have with us today Brother Michael Sean Spence, who is the Director of Policy Implementation, Director of Policy and Implementation at Everytown for Gun Violence, and oversees the National Gun Violence Initiative. So Michael Sean, I want you to tell us all about your experience. You have worked with law enforcement, you engage with elected officials, you've been a prosecutor yourself, but ultimately, so much of the conversation around gun violence, the national conversation, at least as it pertains to D.C., is centered around mass shootings and red flag laws and high-intensity magazines and assault weapons. But talk to us about some actionable policy items for everyday gun violence, not just mass shootings, and what can we be doing in the policy arena to help end this national epidemic?
So one, thank you for having me, and thank all of you for being here. We're called Everytown for Gun Safety, not gun violence, so no worries. I just want to make sure everyone in the room knows. Thank you for sharing a bit of my background. I'll share a little bit more. I first interacted with the issue of gun violence in 1996. At the age of 14, my mother had gotten me a cross and a gold chain on 34th Street. Someone pulled a gun on me and popped it. That was my first interaction. Years later, after growing up in East Elmhurst, I don't know who's familiar, but that's where Malcolm X lived when his house was firebombed. I had little interaction with gun violence in that community. And it was after I finished at Howard Law and moved back to Queens as a ADA that I then served as counsel to NYPD's 113th Precinct following the killing of Sean Bell, who was 8 months my junior at the time of his death. So here I am, a 24-year-old new prosecutor, and I'm in this precinct, and I'm the voice of the prosecutor's office for the community. I'm the community's voice to the prosecutor's office. And obviously, I connected with Sean Bell's story. For me, it was very clear that had I been in that situation, in that circumstance, that it would have been me. At the same time, I knew that there was a critical role for law enforcement to play, as the chief said earlier. And it was important for me to be a truthful voice, one to the community, to let them know with transparency what was happening, but also to be honest with the prosecutor and the lead prosecutor, now deceased, DA Richard Brown, being truthful with him about what the community desired of him and the office and what was necessary. And the first step truly was engaging with the community. So that's much of the work that I do now as the Director of Policy and Implementation. But even before joining Everytown, I was a special assistant in New York State for current Governor Cuomo, where I consulted the Gun-Involved Violence Elimination Initiative. This is an initiative that is active in 17 counties across New York State that works closely with police, sheriffs, probation, parole, as well as local gun violence prevention groups to identify where the violence is happening and the individuals that are perpetrating this violence so that we can tailor the solutions, some of which I'll talk about in a second, and direct them to the communities that need them the most. Some of those strategies include group violence intervention, which is a law enforcement dependent strategy where community and law enforcement work together to identify the hot spots or those areas that are disproportionately experiencing gun violence, as well as the individuals who, as the chief said, are known individuals, either because they have been shot and been in a hospital, or they are criminal justice involved, and identifying how do we engage with these individuals and change their trajectory in life.
Yes.
Right? How do we wrap them in social services so that they know that perhaps they don't need to carry a gun anymore because you have access to a job, or you have access to education, or you have child care assistance, or many of the other services that individuals who are truly entrapped in these communities need to pull themselves out. I'd like to talk a little bit about where this violence happens and why. I know we had a brief conversation earlier about why people carry guns, but I think we should go a couple decades back. And we really need to focus on those systemic structural inequities, those deliberate policy decisions that were made. I'm talking about gerrymandering, I'm talking about redlining, I'm talking about school segregation, I'm talking about housing segregation. If you look at the communities that are disproportionately impacted by gun violence, they are all densely populated, they are racially segregated, they have little to no access to proper education, employment opportunity. This is not coincidental. These environments were created, and because of their existence, they allow the violence to thrive. And that is a large part of the reason why people have fear when they're in their own communities, when they're going to the bus stop, when they're playing basketball on the basketball court, when they're walking to school, when they're coming home from work. It's because these environments have been created for the violence to thrive. And that's why many people do pick up the guns. I also want to touch on a couple other points that were mentioned. Domestic violence. When I first started as a prosecutor, I was a DV prosecutor. And one thing I knew then, and I know even more now at Everytown with the research we've done, is that simply having access to a firearm makes any situation deadly. Conflict will always happen between people who know each other as well as strangers. It's when they have access to the firearm that the lives are then lost. So we know mommy and daddy gonna fight. Boyfriends and girlfriends will fight. What we have to do is reduce the access to the firearms, and when people do lawfully have firearms, we have to ensure that they are locked and secured, and so that people who may want to pick it up have to take that next step to get it. We talked a little bit about St. Louis and Chicago. Something that I say when I travel is you have to be careful of how you look at gun violence. You can look at the aggregate rate, or the aggregate amount, which will always end up pointing to Chicago, right? Because they have some of the highest numbers. But when you look at the actual rate per capita based on the amount of people who live in a community and the rate of gun violence that they're exposed to, it's actually East St. Louis, Illinois. How many people have heard of that city before? We need everyone to raise their hand when that city is mentioned. They are in crisis. They have been in crisis. One of the strategies that I talk about is VOCA. VOCA is a federal fund. It is resourced by fines from courts, restitution payments by defendants. VOCA is then distributed to every state, all 50 states. About, I want to say, a couple years ago, it was increased. States now get anywhere from $50 to $150 million to spend on victim compensation and victim assistance. I took a look at East St. Louis. The only one receiving VOCA funds are the prosecutor. And that takes me to the other part of my work, It's raising up the local gun violence prevention groups, those who are doing the work on the ground, those who are in the communities, knowing how the gun violence is experienced and have a unique perspective as to the solutions they need, the resources they also need to advance the strategies they're already implementing. Last year, we created our first annual City Gun Violence Grant Program where we identified 11 groups around the nation in disproportionately impacted communities, including St. Louis, Kansas City, as well as Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, and everywhere else in between. We now advance $100,000 per group, and we also work with them to give them peer-to-peer guidance, connect them with academic researchers, provide them access to information and data based on their community, their state, and the nation. And that simple step, allowing them to know what the landscape is, what's needed, and what's capable, has already bolstered those specific groups' efforts, and we look to do that again next year. But beyond that, that is the sort of work we need to be comprehensively supporting and identifying and advancing. It's working with these groups on the ground. It's implementing hospital-based violence intervention programs, which are targeted to non-fatal injuries, individuals who are probably involved with the criminal justice system, who are likely to pick up a gun and retaliate, because much of the violence is retaliation, right? With a hospital-based violence program, doctors have the unique opportunity to engage individuals at that early intervention point to hopefully provide them with many of those social services I began with, and also to help them get into job training programs. In Baltimore, specifically, hospital-based violence intervention programs have been incredibly successful. Those in the encatchment areas who have opted into those services have experienced anywhere from a 39 to 62% increase in educational and employment outcomes. That means individuals who came in with a gunshot wound left with services and were able to get back into school and were able to get jobs. This is not unique to Baltimore. This strategy has been implemented across the nation. In Cleveland, the Attorney General for the state of Ohio has supported the implementation of 2 programs like that, and it's catching like wildfire. In Massachusetts, Massachusetts General Hospital recently put out a document identifying critical steps doctors should be taking when first engaging these individuals.
And I think if I could add to that, you know, where I am at Emory, at Grady, really, we did do that, right? It's called Pivot. We want to pivot away. It's a program to intervene against violence and treatment for our young people. So we outreach and do treatment so that we can prevent, because prevention is certainly better than what we have now, and we need the evidence from a public health approach. All of us on this panel are part of that, right? Do you educate, do you enforce? Do you enact, do you engineer, right? What are the things we need to do? So thank you for that.
Definitely.
With violence intervention programs and what we can do, because it needs to happen. They're not new, they're over 20 years old.
Exactly. And there are other strategies as well that don't require a hospital.
That's right.
Or the police, right? There's a strategy called crime prevention through environmental design. It acknowledges the fact that the structured environments in our community impact our ability to enjoy it or to be safe.
That's right.
CPTED could be as simple as changing a 2-way street to a 1-way street in a densely populated area or close to a drug market, for instance. It could be adding lights to low-light areas. It could be mowing egress locations. These are overgrown vacant lots where crime can occur, where guns can be hidden. It could be simply putting up murals to beautify an area. In Philadelphia, for instance, they did a CPTED project, and the individuals who lived in the immediate environs of that CPTED project showed an increase of almost 30% in enjoyment. People were more likely to go outside. They were more likely to enjoy their space. And I'm sure we'll get into more strategies.
Brother Michael Sean, you know a little bit about policy, brother.
Just a little.
Thank you. Now, I've got to get, Chief has to get out of here. He's a man in high demand during our conference this weekend. But I want to open it up for questions, and if I could take the privilege of asking Commissioner Harrison. The first question, Commissioner, you talked about the culture and changing the culture that tells young people, or people of all ages really, that they need a gun, and getting to that root cause and reversing that culture and convincing them that they don't need to step outside of the house with a gun. That's something I totally agree with. But specifically from a law enforcement policy side, I think that the knee-jerk reaction when we talk about what are law enforcement solutions, the knee-jerk reaction is, we've all heard it before, more police on the street, right? That's what people tend to say. And I don't suggest that that's wrong, but please give us the next step in law enforcement solutions to everyday gun violence.
Great question. Look, I see one of my council members here who's a great partner, and we have this conversation all the time. The answer to the question is actually yes, maybe, and no. Many of us suffer from manpower shortages, but many of us need more police officers to do the work that the citizens demand of us and expect of us to keep you safe and to make you feel safe. But it is what we want officers doing that really is the context beneath that question. Sometimes it is not more officers to be more of an occupying force and more heavy-handed enforcement. It is probably more strategic enforcement into the subset of individuals who we know are committing the violence, to hold them accountable, and more officers to create more high-level community engagement that builds trust, builds relationships, and fosters community participation to help us solve more crimes. We teach officers now, we need you to build relationships that were never built, improve good ones, and repair bad relationships. And it is what we want the officers to do is the more important question than the amount of officers. So as we use technology and smart deployment strategies to reduce the amount of work we have to do so we can build the free time, sometimes we can add more officers just by being smart about how we deploy. Sometimes we need more officers because the environment has caused many people to not want to have this as a profession. So yes, we need more, but it is what type of officer we want and what we want them doing that is actually more important than the number.
Fantastic.
Right?
Thank you so much, Chief. I know
Thank
you got to
you all.
run, but thank you for
Please
being
thank our
with us.
Congressman for inviting me, and thank you all.
We will do that. Thank you, sir. Yeah.
Oh, we got a
Chief,
question.
Chief, you got a question specifically for you.
We got a question.
Hey,
So you said that you believe that the police will be able to help, as in it's more police in communities. The thing that police say is that they're here to serve and protect. Yes. Okay. So, do you believe that the reason that the youth or other people or anything carry guns or anything because the police scare us?
I think it's a combination of both. I think people are carrying guns because they think they need to carry them, because they think there are people who want to harm them, who want to rob them, and retaliate against them for a number of reasons. I don't believe people carry guns because they think the police want to harm them. I have not, in my 28 years, met anyone who said or thought they were carrying a gun to use it on a police officer. It was usually on another person in the community who wanted to commit some kind of harm. And it's always been my experience that people don't want to ever get caught by the police carrying guns. So it's not the police that make them want to carry the guns, it's other violent offenders who, in our community, who make us think that we have to do that. But there is a conversation that has to be had always about creating better relationships between police and community members so that we can, as we change culture inside our police department, we change culture in the community as well.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Make
Okay.
sense?
One more question.
Chief's got to run.
I'm gonna tell the people across the hall.
All right, last one. It is okay. Based on our history, as you know, as me as a Black African American young man, do you think that the youth or anybody else of my color are wrong for the things that they experience or the things that they do due to the fact that what we already have been through to actually protect ourselves?
That is a great question. And it is not, you're asking me what I think, so that's about my personal experience, but then there's also my professional experience. And people do things out of two reasons, because they want to or because they have to. There are some people who do things, as you heard our policy expert, the system has been created and designed that puts us in a position to where people will do things out of survival, and people will do things out of necessity because they think it's necessary. And then there are some people who just want to do them, though they think that they want to do it. They may also be doing it out of necessity. It is wrong because the law says it is wrong. And so it's not always about what I think. It becomes wrong because the law said it's wrong. Laws are created for us to have order in our society. And what we think about the law sometimes helps us make that decision. But some people are doing it out of necessity, out of survival, and some are just doing because it's criminally wrong and they are breaking the law intentionally. And that's usually what we have to use as police and as attorneys. What is the intent? The criminal intent is the thing that has to be measured when we decide to bring a case to court. So it's both my personal and professional that, yes, I do think it is wrong, but I do understand why people do it. Some people commit certain crimes out of necessity because they think that they have to. All right?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Chief.
I just want
So, as Brother Ricardo kicked off our interactive Q&A, thank you, sir. Really want to open it up to be more interactive. Whoever has questions or just to share your personal stories and get our expert panelists' reflections on gun violence and your personal story, please speak up and ask the experts.
Before we did that, I just wanted to share, we actually in Chicago have an example of what the commissioner was talking about as far as different ways in which officers can be involved with the community. So we were fortunate enough through a Cook County Violence Prevention Grant, and we partnered with Chicago Police Department and Chicago Association of Women in Law Enforcement. Those female law enforcement officers came to our schools to participate in our mentoring program. So sometimes they were guest mentors. They led restorative, justice practices, peace circles. So it gave the girls a really good opportunity to just get to know them just as regular women. Their likes, their dislikes, their families, what their backgrounds were. And then there were times where it was extremely appropriate to have that kind of just like we have an environment and platform like this, especially like after the Laquan McDonald, decision was released, we actually ended up having a circle right after that. So it just really provided a really authentic opportunity for the girls to communicate directly with law enforcement.
Excellent. And Sister Fine brings up an interesting perspective because she runs a community-based advocacy organization for girls, but she works with the elected officials. She works with the police officers. They work with the hospitals. You heard Brother Michael Sean talk about hospital-based initiatives, and they're all for serving the families who have been affected, like Sister Queen spoke about. So all of this stuff is interconnected, and none of these folks, although they have individual expertise, none of these folks exist in isolation from each other. Again, working with the law enforcement representative who is no longer with us, but I want you all to think as we consider solutions, think about all of this as a coexisting interplay, and it takes all of these folks with all of these various expertise and different silos of resources to be able to come together. So consider that as we process solutions going forward. My brother in the back, did you have a question?
Hi, my name is Will Dyson. The students you see in the room are mine. This is the 27th year I've done this at the Black Caucus, and I've always bring my students. First 10 or 12 years, my students were the only students in this facility. Have a thing to Congressional Black Caucus. One, they need to have more things so we do have more kids to address. As you can see, their concerns are here. And I've told my kids as part of the thing to address it, go to the forums, ask questions, find out what's going on, because you're the ones to the future. So I think we need to more specialize in something where we're bringing in more kids or address or, let's say, approach the high schools about bringing more kids in so they can view these things as they're taking place here. I'm a fellow Bison.
Yes.
I guess with this is that my kids and the exposure, sometimes you take it for granted. We're out of Prince George's County, but if I know she knows, there's an inner side of the Beltway and there's an outside the Beltway. Inside the Beltway is more like where we are, they refer to us as Ward 8 from DC. The reason being that our kids are not, the things you take for granted that they will have, the exposure they have, they don't. The things you have, like the first time I got there when I had a son of one of the children of mine say, I've never ridden the subway here. There's some things you take for granted when you're here. Matter of fact, to be honest with you, I have a substitute right now. She's a former student who's doing the program that you're doing. She's coming back into school. She's a substitute because she wants to get with the kids and involvement. The biggest thing I do, and the reason I bring my kids here, is the exposure. A lot of times we take for granted, oh, they don't know, and it's just taken for granted. My kids need to be exposed to what it is that's out here, and so they can take it back with their fellow people. Now, Ricardo is here this second time, and there are others, and I'll keep doing this every year until I finish up. But my thing is we have to bring our youth in sooner, let them know what's happening on and how things are happening, and address them so they can address their peers. Because the fact of the matter is, most of the kids listen to their peers before they're adults. And the more exposure we can get to the peers to get them to talk to their other peers about what's going on, the better chance we have of succeeding and killing the violence, and you excuse the pun, but taking care of the violence and dealing with the issues and where they're going for the future. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'll actually comment on that because I think, and we did, thank you guys for being here, but I think it's notable that this movement, gun violence prevention movement, is starting to be led by the youth. And I think it's important that we note that the vast majority of those youth leaders don't look like the youth in this room. And it's important that we bring you guys into the fold and that you guys are empowered to take leadership, because at the end of the day, the black males, the young black males, the young black females are the most likely intended targets. And it's important we know your perspective, we know how you're experiencing the violence. And Professor, I will come and I will visit with you and I will talk to you guys more about gun violence if you would like me to, for sure.
Excellent. Excellent. I'd like to acknowledge the license collector of the City of St. Louis, city elected official, the Honorable Michael Butler, with a question.
I was just going to say, hey, I'm Michael. I'm from the City of St. Louis. Hey, Jared. I have a question about cure violence, and it's mostly from Ms. Fair and Mr. Spence. Ms. Fair, you're from Chicago. In St. Louis, the new program, the new shiny thing is the cure violence program, and we're going to invest at least $500,000, looking for more money into it. Want to know your opinion on the program, and then Mr. Spence, from a national perspective, what do you know about the program and how it works, and is it effective?
Well, I can't speak directly to that program, but I can't do nothing but say amen to what this gentleman just back here brought up. I wish we would think more prevention. In Chicago, I feel like, because it is so political, it's like, oh my God, it's in the headlines, and it's a lot of Band-Aid approaches. What do we do really quickly to get this out of the headlines? And often they go directly and look only at teenagers. Mm-hmm. With girls in particularly, and this is any group of girls, by 6th grade, most girls' self-esteem takes a nosedive. There are studies that say by 3rd through 5th grade, girls are deciding what they're capable of as far as a future career or what they're not. So for me, when it comes to prevention, I'd love to see more strategies, but I feel like I am constantly trying to minister to people about if you would start workforce development and exposing them to opportunities so that they can see the potential in 3rd through 5th grade. Then you've got a stronger middle school student. Then you've got a stronger high school student that is in a better place to take advantage of the opportunities. But it's just real basic. If they can't see it, they can't achieve it or believe it. And it's something that we all benefited from. We were all in really early programs, and it seems like we're having to re-talk about it again, like it's some nuanced thing. It ain't new. So I am, when I talk about prevention, I think it's really critically important to start those type of programs in elementary school.
I think,
Ms. Shelton,
I'm sorry.
get right to you.
Shelton from St. Louis, Missouri, and I grew up in Kansas City. Kudos to you and to you, sir, for working with our youth. And I'm so glad that you all are here, working with students from, okay, because I thought I had a very strong voice, working with students from kindergarten through high school. And one of the things that I have not heard while I've been here, not in this session, is about doing an overhaul of our educational system. It hasn't changed since the 17th century, but we are dealing with students at the 21st century. We've got to start, because a lot of those kids that sag and they carry guns, they have a lot to offer our society.
Yeah.
But in our schools, we're not giving them hope. We don't have the best standing in front of them. We have a lot of people that when they walk in, it's not important if they're not prepared to learn. We've got to give them experiences. How do I have students who have never been on an airplane? Right. How do I have students that don't know anything about the legal system other than what can happen? So we have got to, please, I beg you, to start looking at and putting policy in places to change our educational system. It's a shame that we have children that can't read. How is it that you can't read and you're in middle school, high school, and you go on to college and you can't read?
Right.
And so when those students come to me and they're in 6th grade and they can't read, they'll tear my school up. And so they're so frustrated that they go out into our communities and they have to do other things. They have to have guns. They don't have any skills, communication skills. Right. So now they're dealing drugs. And I'm going to tell you, these kids have some skills. If you think they don't, they do.
Yeah.
So how are we going to do an overhaul of our educational system? It's past due. Our teachers can't get in those classrooms and do everything. And then you have the principals asking for this. You have the superintendents asking for stuff. Yeah. So what? They can check the box. But in the meantime, our children are struggling. And young people, stand up and tell us what's going on. You all are quiet, and you know you know. Talk to folks. You don't want to hear us anymore. Kudos to you, young man, for standing up and telling us what's going on. Tell folks what's going on. You all know what they need to hear. I already know.
What about when they leave home and come to school though? You know, home plays a big part here of when that child goes to school, and reading and education and communication skills. You know, a lot of things with the dinner table is verbal abuse. Yeah. We talk to each other any kind of way at home. And so, no, we're not prepared to be educated when we get up and go to school. We bring the misplaced anger a lot of times to school with us because domestic violence then kept us up all night long. And the grades and things that we should be making, you know, a lot of children can't press forward because of that. You have children who are falling asleep, you know, because they done been up all night with the ruckus that go on in their household. You know, that does plays a huge factor when children end up in the school. And I know it. I tell my students, like, okay, how many of us woke up with an attitude this morning? How many of us are just mad? I get like 30 students raise their hand. You mad already? You just got to school. See, that's coming from home. So, you know, so how do we get in the platform of having our children being able to communicate effectively at that dinner table? We have a lot of children that are dealing with parents who have mental illness and addiction problems. How are we going to counteract that to get them really focused for school?
I think so from a healthcare professional lens, if I could, there are adverse childhood experiences. So I'm going to put on my medical hat here. And we can't deny or forget and need to study the impact of adverse childhood experiences on the outcomes that can happen that can lead to gunshot wounds and violence and death. And I think what we're clearly hearing that should happen is more research, evidence, and things that we can do and must do to be able to bring all these constructs together so we can understand and penetrate very clearly how to impact what we're talking about today. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the National Medical Association's entire section yesterday on gun violence. And they talked about the link about mental health, not to pathologize people with mental health issues, but to be clear that that could be part of the narrative, to talk about the need for funding to be able to do what's necessary to move the needle on this issue. If you look at how much money has been put in and actually been ceased since 1996 because of the Brady Bill, only $20 million in 2017 by the National Institutes of Health to look at the impact of gunshot wounds in terms of children. And so what we really need to think about is how can we take the evidence, the data, the funding needed to look at the experiences by our youth, by other individuals, to be able to make substantive, real change that could perhaps change the outcomes of individuals who are either directly impacted by gunshot wounds themselves or the people who are around them. So I just needed to say that.
So I'd like to, one, get back to the gentleman's question real briefly because it wasn't answered, and then I'll come back to this other issue regarding education. So regarding Cure Violence, one, that is an evidence-based strategy that we do support. For those who aren't aware of what it is, it's essentially street outreach work. It was founded by Dr. Gary Slutkin from Chicago, after he had gone to Africa. He was working on infectious diseases there, and he realizes there was an analogy between infectious disease and the way gun violence is experienced and spreads throughout communities. He identified it, he came back, he created the Cure Violence model, and he implemented this strategy which uses credible messengers. These are people who have been involved in the violence. They've either been shot at, or been involved in the life one way or another. They train these individuals, they pay these individuals, and these folks are on the street. They're engaging with shooters, those who are at risk of being shot, and they work to try to prevent them from ever doing that. They try to get them into job training, other sort of services that can assist them. It is very successful. It's been implemented across the nation. We are working with a number of cities to advance it, Jacksonville being one, as well as a number of other cities. And I congratulate St. Louis on taking the next step to making that happen, because it is a great strategy and it does work. There are some obstacles. One, street outreach workers need to know where the crime is happening. They need to know who's driving it, which means they have to talk to law enforcement. Law enforcement knows. They also need to talk to the hospitals. The hospitals know who's coming in, when they're coming in, what communities they're coming in from with gunshots. So these are some of the obstacles that street outreach workers are having across the nation, because many police struggle with the change in mindset, because these are folks that they used to arrest, right? And now they're working on the same side, and they don't want to communicate. So that's something that every city needs to work towards.
I just want to point out something very important just happened here that usually happens in private circles, but we have a citywide elected official who has a program that folks are talking about implementing, and it's the new hot thing in his city. We have substantive subject matter experts, and a citywide elected official just said, hey man, they around here, what they talking about? Are they okay? And that's what we need to be doing. Don't let these people come into your communities with solutions without vetting them. That's what this conference is for, to vet people, to talk about what they're doing. Is this good? And he said, yes, not only are they good, but they're good for other cities nationwide, but there are some caveats that you need to know about. That is why we're here, and I hope that that was not lost on anybody, that was a very authentic, rooted in blackness conversation that was just had. And that's why we have this conference every year. We should acknowledge the honorable gentle lady from the 2nd District of Illinois, representing the greater Chicago area. Congresswoman Robin Kelly is here. Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, the Congresswoman, and as she just said, the Congresswoman and her colleague, Representative Lucy McBath, votes were in Congress, so they have real jobs, and ALC is not the only thing happening in D.C. Very important votes happening on Capitol Hill that they had to pertain to, so thank you so much for joining us. Your sister Kelly Fine has done you very proud here today, representing the city of Chicago. I should acknowledge, as we did when we started, that Congresswoman Kelly has been an innovator in our Congress, because she has brought to Congress the idea of looking at gun violence as a national and public health epidemic. So thank you, and we have tried to root our conversation today here based in that. Are there any other questions, please?
Before we move on, I also want to touch
Yes,
on those educational solutions that we were talking about before, school-based solutions, many of which are being implemented in Chicago. Mayor Lightfoot's Summer of Change, most recently, which identified at-risk youth in specific schools and provided resources to them over the course of the summer. But in addition to that, the University of Illinois, as well as other universities around the state, and as well as other states, are engaging with local school departments. They're talking about gun violence. They're providing them with an outlet for that trauma. They're going into the schools and are identifying the kids who are saying they have either been exposed to it, have experienced it, or in fear of it, and they're giving them creative outlets. Going back to Ward 8, yesterday I was on a panel with Ms. Ryan Nickens from the Trayron Center. She works with youth in D.C., and she similarly provides creative therapeutic outlets. 2 days ago, they had to shelter in place as gunshots went off at around 4 p.m. as kids were returning from school and going to the center. She's dealing with that trauma. And like you said, one of her issues is that many of the teachers in the schools are young white females. One, they don't recognize the issue. Two, they can't relate to the kids. Three, they're not prepared to provide them with any sort of trauma counseling or other services that can decrease that impact. And that is an issue that's endemic across the nation. So going back to what can we do in schools, one, we can implement school-based services that identify the kids because they're right in our midst, who have either been involved or are fear of it. We can direct support services to them that give them an outlet to express that trauma, but also to remove them from that trauma. And then we can put people in the schools who are aware of the violence and are prepared to deal with the trauma that ensues from it. So those are some of the strategies that work in schools and are already being implemented.
We cannot ignore that parental engagement piece, that home piece, because what you brought up is a chronic problem that we've had with education over years. Yep. This is a generational issue. Yep. So if these kids are traumatized in their school settings, their mamas and their mamas have been traumatized in school settings as well. So they're not really equipped with the skills and the experiences to advocate for their children because they may not have been advocated for as well. So, you know, one of the things that I'm also very invested in is, and we started to pilot, is we have to provide support services and do skill development both for the young girls and the young people that we're serving, but also for their parents as well. Yeah. So we've had Mommy and Me programs and conferences where moms and daughters are building career and communication skills together. We have a Pink Heart Hats initiative. There are, 30 million jobs that will be available in 2020 in trades and manufacturing. They're looking to women for that. Black women should be prepped for that. A faster path into the middle class, but they need to be exposed to it. Some of it is just basic grandma wit and wisdom. When did we stop having expectations for our kids to be the best? So that goes back to, again, what you mentioned, the staff and the people who are going in and working these programs. You say you really want to be involved in this, but are you really ready and equipped? And are you going to see the best in them no matter what's going on? So, everybody, our whole community is in need of this. And it's not just picking one or picking the other. We're all traumatized. We're all in need of trust. We're all in need of skill development. We're all in need of all of that.
Don't need me. That's all I would ask.
Yeah. So I don't want to forget the parents.
And one of the things that my program does too is when we go in to talk about domestic violence, I hold two sessions for the boys and a session for the girls. Nobody is talking to these young men about domestic violence and emotional wellness. They don't know words to feeling. And sometimes the girls get lost in it. But I'm having two separate conversations because the young men have been left out of, how do you feel? How are you in a relationship? Is that girl or is that young man putting their hands on you in that relationship? We have a lot of young boys that are in relationships that are the victim. But we don't talk to them. And then you wonder why we're going to say, our young black boys are killing. Nobody's asking. They tell you, shut up, suck it up. Boys don't show their emotion. Get yourself together. I'm not raising no punk. That's inappropriate to tell a young man or a young boy that. But this is what we've grown them, like she said, generations of telling young boys to suppress, emotionally suppress. And so what do we have then? We have a beast by the time he gets 16. Two separate conversations when it comes to domestic violence. And we are behind when it comes to the young man and to men. We are completely behind about asking the young man how you feel in that relationship or in that friendship. And when I go into the schools and address the young men, they be so excited about having a platform to talk about this kind of conversation. That is affecting them in the household because your mama done told you she didn't raise no punk. And then your girlfriend telling you the same thing. You are a punk. And the other thing is no such thing as play fighting. There's no such thing as that, play fighting. No, you're not play. You're going to fight. But we use that to cover up what could really be domestic violence.
Queen, I think we had some questions from some of our young students here. How about we go from that side and progress this way? And ma'am, I think you did as well. She's Naya, senior from Potomac High School.
Yes.
Anaya Weissman from Potomac High School, and I'm about to go into the real world. And we are not exposed to what's going to be out in the real world. Like, my mom, she's so afraid of me going out there. She wants me to just stay in the house with her so she could protect me. And there's no type of programs in school to explain what's out there. We're in school to learn about the world. We're trying to gain knowledge to go out into the real world to thrive, but we're not exposed to that. Why aren't we?
Well, I have something that might assail your fears, and maybe you can pass this on to your mom. And I know we spoke a little bit earlier about how gun violence is experienced in this nation and how 100 people die every day, 36,000 per year. But what people don't talk about is how concentrated the violence is. So 50 cities account for 1 in 3 gun-related homicides, only 50. 127 account for more than half of gun-related homicides. And even within those cities, it's not across the city, as we all know, in D.C., in New York, where I'm from. It's in those pockets of those cities, small, contained communities. And even within those communities, everyone is not violent. It's a very small number of people who are actually in the social networks that are involved or exposed to the violence. A couple years ago, research was done that showed in Chicago, only 1% of the total population was exposed, involved, or at risk. In New Orleans, it was 2%, approximately 600 to 700 people. We know where the violence is happening. We know who's perpetrating that violence. And if anyone is interested, it was Dr. Papachristos. He put out the research, if you want to take a look at it for yourself. But what we know is simply being outside isn't dangerous. Simply being in cities isn't dangerous. Being on school campuses isn't dangerous. And the people who are likely to be shot most likely are already involved in the violence. So you're likely to be very safe.
The other thing I would have you all consider, a bit tangential but real to your question, is the power and the value of mentorship and of engaging in positively focused and engaged individuals such as people on the stage and in your communities who can help guide your thought and thinking around where you want to be and where you want to aspire to, right? So I do a lot of mentoring, as I'm sure everyone else on this panel, either directly through my work or through my communities, my church, fill in the blank. And I would encourage you to seek out and find those pockets of places where you can thrive, because they do exist. And we are colored by this unfortunate reality of hate and injury and harm, which we know exists. But let's not forget the other side, right? You're looking at it.
Well, and I got to mention this. I've been running this program, Polished Pebbles, in Chicago for 10 years. I left my junior executive corporate job at McGraw-Hill as a national marketing manager at 26, 27 years old to start this. Yeah. Why there are not more programs? Because they do not support and provide adequate funding and resources for those type of programs to live and be in your school year after year after year. Much of my work with trying to run this organization, where we serve over 600 girls a year with a budget that is only about $250,000. How do you get those mentors, those great role models, to be in programs in your schools? You got to fund it. But the work that we have to go through to encourage people to invest in our communities and our young people. Some of the questions we talked about are, what are some of the adverse effects of gun violence on our communities? People don't want to invest in them. They say, these kids don't matter. Right. You're not worth it, but you are worth it. Yeah. But we have to continue to get the word out about how to invest in you, what your story is like, that you want to be exposed. But we have to fund the work. That's right. The work that we do with girls is not just cute, it's not just nice, it is necessary. She needs to be equipped to go out, and we have to fund it to get there. His programs, his salary, so he can go home and live a good lifestyle. We could pull more talented people straight from universities if we funded those, so then they're not attracted to go out into the private sector. They will want to work in education, work in the public sector, and work for social services. That's a big part of it. They got to pay for it.
I should acknowledge two of our fantastic leaders who just came. Sister Melissa Harris Perry, one of our preeminent journalists, and her husband, Brother James Perry. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us. And our co-convener, we heard from Congresswoman Robin Kelly earlier, a sister who is a genuine mother of the movement, a congresswoman from Georgia's 6th District who turned a tragedy into her dynamic service here in the United States Congress. Our fantastic host for the day, Congresswoman Lucy McBath. We welcome you. Bring remarks, please come and feel free.
And I'm so grateful that you're here today. Thank you so very much for taking a few moments of your time to come and listen to our panelists today. Thank each and every one of you for your time and your effort and the expertise and the value that you bring on this issue. We're in a very critical time. That's right. Very, very critical time, and I truly believe that this is the time there will be tremendous movement on this issue of gun safety, gun violence prevention. This is our time. Our communities are disproportionately affected by what continues to be the scourge of gun violence every single day. And the only one that has the ability to make the change, the ones that have the ability to really create and stimulate the change that we need to keep our communities safe is us. And so I'm so grateful that you're here today to really hear some solutions, talking about the cost of gun violence. The cost of gun violence is to do nothing. That is the cost, to do absolutely nothing. And so I know, along with my colleagues and I, Congresswoman Kelly, have been on the front lines for gun safety, been on the front lines for gun violence prevention, and we will not stop, because to do nothing means that we are complicit. And so we've been taking very hard votes. I just voted on Judiciary Committee just the other day. We sat there for 8 hours, making sure that we put forth gun legislation that protects each and every one of you in our communities and our future generations. Very tough votes. Of course, you know the NRA gun lobby. That is where we have most of our opposition. Also, of course, with the Senate Republicans. So we need each and every one of you here today to go back to your communities, go back to the people that you live and work among every single day. We need a huge grassroots movement. It takes more than just marching in the streets and rallying. They're important, but it's extremely critical to build the grassroots movement from the bottom up to help those of us that are here in Washington fighting on your behalf. It takes working from the bottom up as well as from the top to really create the climate that's safe for all of us. And so I thank you so very much for being here today. Thank you so much for finding it important to continue to champion for safer communities. And we will continue to fight on your behalf always. I know that is what I am charged to do, and I know that's why God brought me here. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you so much, Congresswoman. We had more questions from our students. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Well, my name is Kanae Graham. I'm also from Potomac High School. I feel like we wake up every day to see someone getting shot, and it's on the news. It's just something that's constantly in the media. What can we do? I guess my question is, as a community, what can we make as a policy to try to take away gun violence, especially when it's revolved around minors as well, when minors are like illegally selling guns to other minors and stuff? What can we do as a community to change that?
I woke up on the day of my daughter's murder. That's a very good question, but it's a hard question. But I woke up from sleeping that night and woke up and my daughter was on the TV. She'd been shot in the head. And instantly I started saying, all these things started, like, how can we stop this? How can we prevent? All these things started flooding my mind. On the day of my daughter's murder as well, I had to do a domestic violence event. The same day my daughter was murdered. people were expecting me to come out and do this event the same day that my daughter was murdered. And so the baby, you know, got caught up in Child Protective Services, and once they brought the baby back to me, I took my butt on over there to that event. So this is within 6 hours of being murdered. I'm at a domestic violence event that my organization put on to talk to who? Guess what? Men that are victims of domestic violence. So you say, what can we do? We still got to have the conversation. We have to talk about it. You guys have to say what you feel about it. You know, you guys have to give us some information, because y'all don't want to snitch. You don't snitch. You don't. And you know your friend or your boyfriend or your girlfriend, you know it's a gun somewhere in there. You didn't seen it. You might have held it and played with it, but you're not going to snitch. So, yeah, that's a good question. Back to you. What can we do to get y'all to get information on? Because you know it.
So,
I'll add to that as
Please.
well.
Thank you, Queen.
So one, as I mentioned earlier, we know that the violence is happening at a breakneck speed, 100 per day, in fact, 1/3 homicide. So your reality is experienced across this nation. What policies was your question, right? What policies can reduce? So one, people are either getting those guns illegally, right? Or they're utilizing a gun that was legally sought by a parent or someone over the age of 18. Let's talk about those first. One, those guns need to be locked up. So child access laws that require that these guns be locked away and secured, and there needs to be a consequence for individuals who do not do that and allow these guns to end up in the hands of individuals who are, one, prohibited, so underage or a felon, or that utilize these guns illegally. So that's one half of it. On the back end of it, we also have a flow of illegal guns, right? So we've already taken a great step earlier this year when the House sent their universal background check bill to the Senate. That needs to get passed. That's what we need. We need to make sure people do not have a loophole through which they can access a firearm. And those individuals might be the adult in the house. It might be the older sibling. But if they're prohibited from having that gun to begin with, it won't get into that home for the juvenile to utilize either against themselves or against someone else. So those are two policy positions that would help.
They're illegal. They're already illegal. So how's that policy going to help when they are in these homes illegal? Yeah. My son had a gun that I slept under the pillow, under my pillow. And I happened to stick my hand and felt the gun. I didn't give him permission. My husband was a minister. We didn't give him no permission to have no gun, but the gun was there. How did it get there? I didn't bring it in. My husband didn't bring it in at the time. So how do we stop it from the door?
Yeah.
How do we stop my son? How did he get that gun? And then the worst thing of it, I was so angry, and I'm so grateful to God that I took that gun, pointed at him, and pulled the trigger. And it was by the grace of God that that gun did not go off. How did that gun get in my house? How did I get that angry where I pulled that trigger? There are more moms like me. There are some more out there that don't know how those guns got there. And it ain't black folks bringing those guns into those neighborhoods.
Exactly,
okay?
exactly.
Those black folks are not bringing them guns there.
Exactly.
But they are getting there. How? Why don't we stop it from there? Stop it there.
And that is the idea. And one, thank you for sharing that story. But that is the idea, that black folks are not the ones trafficking these guns. It's straw purchasers. It's individuals who are buying them at gun shows where they're not going through a background check. Perhaps they're felons and prohibited themselves. They're then coming into the city or whatever municipality, and they're acting as de facto gun dealers, selling guns to individuals who are also prohibited, but they themselves are breaking the law by doing the sale in itself. Right. So these are different intervention points prior to it getting into the home that can decrease the likelihood it ever ends up there. So whoever that individual was who sold him that gun, didn't send him through a background check, they broke the law. That person needs the law enforced against them, and hopefully it won't end up in another home.
You know, yes, sir, my brother, and then I think we're going to have to, I'm going to let the panelists wrap up. Yes, sir. Stand up, young man.
So my name is Jason. I'm from Potomac High School, and it was more of like a personal connection to what you were talking about men and domestic violence. So
Absolutely.
I have a cousin who had a girlfriend. He's in jail. Who had a girlfriend who was would verbally threaten him, say she would get him and her and him to come harm him. So he actually bought a gun in fear of his safety to protect himself. And she actually did bring someone to try to harm him, and they ended up getting in an altercation. He shot the other guy trying to protect himself and ended up being in jail. But I don't think it was fair because he actually called the police on her, and they came and was like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. It's probably him doing something to her. And they didn't take the time out to see his point of view.
That's right.
So I was going to say, I appreciate you talking to young men about that type of situation, because it did, made me feel oh, if something like this happens to me, no one's going to help me.
Absolutely. The laws, when it comes to domestic violence, are not favored towards men at all. You guys are not even in the laws. The Violence Against Women Act needs to be reformed. This is an act that only supports really women. And the movement started years ago with women, yes. But women had young boys at that dinner table too, that was victims of domestic violence when they were small. But you guys had to suck it up, handle your household. And then law enforcement, sometimes when they come out, they don't even identify with the male being the victim of domestic violence. And so you're right, it's nothing to support you. You have to have your own evidence to show that you are the victim in this situation. It's ridiculous. How are you talking about domestic violence, but you've left young boys out of the conversation? What would make you think that a young man or a young boy could not be a victim of domestic violence? This is ridiculous, the way America has designed this conversation. So yes, I speak out because I abuse men. So I know that it can be done. And I know that it's a lot of young girls and women that do it. And I used the gun and was intending to kill. So I know that it's being done. But, America do not have it where women are held accountable or young girls are held accountable for being an abuser. That conversation is not being had. And then we don't take seriously that men and boys are victims of domestic violence. Young men, y'all have to be very careful with the women that these young girls that y'all get in relationships with. You have to be very careful. They talk to you any kind of way. They put you down and say things that are inappropriate. And then you guys say it to each other, and guess what's going to happen? At the end of the day, guess what? She got a bad attitude, and now you got a bad attitude. What you think going to happen? I'm going to keep it real with y'all. Somebody going to end up dead. Just like my daughter. You guys we have got to have the conversation with young men about how they feel when it comes to emotional issues at the dinner table. We're just not having that conversation. It's wrong. It's wrong that so many black men and young boys have been raised with the idea of if a girl hits you, you just walk away. You just don't do anything. Well, the abuser going to get you here. So you're going to come back to me. Which then most victims die.
Thank you, Sister Queen. So our sister raised a very interesting question when she said, what specific policy could have kept this gun from her doorstep? And, as this is an overall policy conference, we've heard a lot of different holistic solutions and various perspectives, but I think the Congresswoman McBath brought up something very interesting, and there is no specific policy, but it's unacceptable to do nothing policy-wise. Right. And I think that is, while there's not a specific answer to what specific law or bill would have stopped that gun from entering your house, it's unacceptable to do nothing. And I hope that that's the major takeaway as you all begin your voting careers, which we hope is a lifetime of being registered and active voters. And as we all consider these folks running around here saying they want to be your president, I hope we understand that it is unacceptable not to have an agenda for actively opposing gun violence. That is something that we should hold every single candidate. I'll get to you, my sister. We should hold every single candidate or every person who's in your community holding up their hands saying they want to lead. We should hold them accountable to what is your active anti-gun violence agenda. It's unacceptable to do nothing. You know, there's a Dr. King quote for just about everything, and I think he says that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can stop him from lynching me. The law cannot give a heart to the heartless, but it can restrain the heartless. So what is the idea that we can do from a public health perspective, from talking to families at our dinner tables, from training our young girls in our various organizations? What can we do that ultimately can be distilled into policy? And the only thing that we can definitively say is that not doing anything is unacceptable.
True.
So what are our policy solutions? And I hope our young people from Potomac High School come away with ideas about what they can distill into policy. My sister, I'll give you the last question, and I'm going to let our panelists wrap up with each one of their major primary takeaways. We've heard from various perspectives, different silos of expertise, but they all interplay together. Let me give you the last question, and I want each of them to give us the last thing that they want to hammer home here.
Okay, so now the kids are gone. So
the young adults.
Just young adults, kids, you know, I call everybody kid. So one of the things we're talking about, policies, and before, you know, they end up with their last words and things, I think that as we create these policies, who you need to speak to and who needs to be at the table was just right here. We never ask. We just make programs and say, this is what we're going to do. Then we go get the kids and we do it, or this or the third. Would those children need to be at that table, maybe some kind of a youth advisory panel? If you, like Queen said, you have to ask them. They will tell you. Nobody's asking them. Nobody's listening to our children. And that's the problem. And until we have those conversations with them, they have the solutions and the problem. We're not listening to them. And that's the main problem. So we could talk policy, we could talk stats. They don't care about that. That young lady, it hurt my heart to hear her say, how do I go out in the street? Because she's really scared. She's literally shaking. We're not addressing what we need to. We're just spewing numbers. There's a program. We need to get real with this. And the simple solution, I don't know how to make it, is to get the money from the big nonprofits to the people on the grassroots in the streets actually touching the communities, doing the work.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to start on the far end of the table, of course, acknowledging Commissioner Harrison and thank him for his contributions in his absence. Dr. Herron.
Well, first of all, you set the stage and set the table for my comments about what we need, right? So I recognize my Congresswoman, Lady McBeth, for inviting me to be here. But what we need is funding. And what we need is how to study what works and what doesn't work, inclusive of our children and all people, so we can get the evidence needed to drive what will work. You're correct. We believe this and we believe that, but we don't know what we don't know until we study what we need to know.
Right.
We got to look at this issue from an evidence-based lens. The physicians, I wear this button, Physicians Against Violence, we think about this. We want to be unmuzzled about this, leave the politics out of it. We have got to seek, find, and get the data. We need to engage individuals to help us get the data. We need to fund individuals in trying to get the data. We need to have the public health approach. I love what you said at the NMA meeting yesterday, Representative Kelly, about getting our Surgeon General to write an impact report on the public health approach to gun violence and gun safety. We need to do those things as a country, as a nation, so that we can all get what we need to save lives and care for our people.
Yeah.
Without that, people will talk and keep talking. But we got to put our money where our mouth is. And we got to fund what needs to be funded to get the science that is necessary to take care of our people.
No, I agree with so many of the sentiments shared today. Funding is critical. It don't work if you can't fund it. But I'm just really also impressed with institutions, individuals, leaders who invest in leaders like me. You know, I come from the south side of Chicago. I lived in that community. I was raised, I was reared in that community. I was reared in those public schools. And so making the investment in the work that we do day to day is critically important. But I think it's also important, the lesson that this gentleman back here is showing us is lifting the voices of these young people.
That's right.
It's preparing them to know how to stand up and say, my name is, I go to Potomac High School, and making sure that they have the confidence that what they have to say matters even in this room, in this space, and hoping that they adopt that level and that kind of passion for advocacy for the rest of their lives, whether it's being like Congresswoman McBath and taking a personal instance and say, I'm going to make a career out of being an advocate for myself and for others, or if it's just, I go to my PTA meeting for my kids. I make sure that my city councilman is accountable. I ask those hard questions that go beyond what people are saying. You know, so I just think helping our young people and starting from the very beginning stages that their voices matter and that they need to advocate for themselves, their schools, their families, and their communities is critically important.
Thank you so much, Kelly Fair. Brother Michael Sean Spence.
Yes. Every town is a national organization, but we have a local footprint. We work with local groups, we work with mayors, we work with elected officials, local gun violence prevention groups. We work at the state level with governors, attorney generals, as well as at the federal level advocating for the laws we know work. We all have a piece of this puzzle. It is critical that we support the groups doing the work because, one, they know what's needed on the ground, and that's one of the things that we have endeavored to do in the last year, as I mentioned earlier, in 11 different cities with 11 different groups to the tune of 1.1 million, but that's just a drop in the bucket. The other part of it is advancing these funding sources that are already out there. So at the federal level, VOCA, making sure local groups know that if you have a victim assistance program, this is a bucket of money that you should be applying for, and that is well-resourced and is available for you. It's about talking to governors and attorney generals about utilizing their unique statutory powers to convene law enforcement, to resource local groups, as well as to have agencies that have not regularly been a part of this fight. Normally it's law enforcement, but I'm talking about Department of Housing. I'm talking about Department of Education. I'm talking about the Department of Health, who also have the ability to implement strategies that strike at the core of the poverty that truly drives the violence in the pockets of our cities that are disproportionately impacted. It's about telling mayors you need to keep your police accountable. It's talking to the police about saying you need to engage with local gun violence prevention groups. As we spoke about earlier when the councilman from St. Louis was speaking, there are those who are on the ground doing the work, and they need to know where to do the work. They need to know who to target the work towards. Police, governmental agencies at the local municipal level have a unique perspective, and they need to be sharing that data. There needs to be data transparency. And then at the local level, in addition to resourcing the groups doing the work in the nuanced way they do it, the kids, the people who call our cities home need to know what's happening. They need to know when the shootings happen. They need to know where it happens. They need to know the response. They need to know. Because at the end of the day, they deserve to know these are their communities that we're in. They also have a unique perspective as to the solutions they need. I know we talked a little bit about children before, but in Chicago, the simple program they have called Safe Passage, where they literally walk kids through high crime areas to ensure that they can get to school in the beginning of the day, is a critical step forward. It's strategies like that that came from the youth in the community who said, this is what we need. This is what we're afraid of. This is the help you guys can provide. And it's being responsive to it once we have engaged those local groups and those students at the local level.
Thank you, Brother Michael Sean. It's so important that we start the way we began, which is centering the human element and the human stories of all of this once we get past the academics and the policy and all of the fluff. Sister Queen Afi Gaston has brought a crucial and critical perspective to the proceedings this evening, and we will allow you to close, ma'am.
Yes, thank you for having me, Congresswoman Kelly and McBath. I'm so happy to be here to share, you know, my daughter's story, but as well as share on behalf of the youth in the DMV. Back to the dinner table. The dinner table is a very important part in all of this. Our youth have to be able to be transparent right at the dinner table, to share their feelings with mom, with dad, with the leadership that is at home. But a lot of times, the leadership is so traumatized, the children become traumatized. And there's no communication going on. There's no talking of how we feel about an issue. You know, what are some of the things that we can do about an issue? You know, how can I stand up and be a part to break that cycle of domestic violence, which then is going to spill over into gun violence, till now somebody is being murdered in the home. So I think we have to open up that dinner table conversation and move away from what goes on in my house stays in my house. Or little children ought to be seen and not heard. We've grown up with this mess of a conversation. And now we want to hear from the youth. Well, how late are we? Asking them how they feel. How many times did your parents ask you how you felt? We're kind of late, but we got to start somewhere. And they're not having these types of conversations at the dinner table. How do I know? Because I talk to them. I'm in the school with them. They tell me all the time, I wish they could have your program as a class. Mm-hmm. Because this is something that they want to talk about. Mm-hmm. And this is something that is prevalent to them. This is something that they don't know the solution to. They have to fit in because they don't want to be the black sheep of the family. Do you? Nobody wants to be the black sheep, so they have to go along with what the family do. And the family can carry guns and have a lot of misplaced anger and don't know how to resolve conflict. You know, if you can't resolve conflict at your dinner table, how you going to resolve conflict with another student or a teacher or a friend? If you're not able to express yourself at the dinner table, how are you going to be able to go out and like the young girl said, and express yourself in the world? Mm-hmm. We must take a deeper look at the dinner, at that family, at the household, and how are we all getting along there? And include the young boy's perspective of how they feel. Thank you for letting me share.
Thank you, Queen Afi. And thank you all for coming. Please make sure to connect. Indeed. Please make sure to connect with these people, be in touch with them, learn from them, and remain in contact with them to provide solutions for y'all's community. Thank you again to Congresswoman Robin Kelly. We'll give her the last word.
I just wanted to thank our moderator. You did an excellent job. And let people know that on September 25th, if you're in the area at 1 o'clock on the west side of the Capitol, we will be having a big gun violence rally. We have people coming in from all over because we are trying to get Mitch to call those bills. So if you're around, please join us.